For those of you who may not know, Walter Rodney was an intellectual. I would call him a revolutionary Marxist intellectual who wrote this book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, in the 70s, and it was published in 1973. And this book has impacted me in such a profound way, just in terms of the breadth and the depth of information that he brings to bear in this group. We did his biography the first session, so I won't repeat it, but for me, this is a definitive book if you want to understand colonialism in Africa. This is the definitive book. So the first question that we're going to be talking about slavery again today, and I think I posed the question, did we go from slavery to freedom or freedom to slavery? Okay, and that's the topic that this addresses. And in this chapter, he's talking about Europe and the roots of African underdevelopment to 1885. So there have been a lot of ways that people have tried to justify the enslavement of Africans. And one is to say that, our own people sold us into slavery. We had agents who worked with the slavers to sell their people out, and all of that is true. This was just a trade, just a trade in human beings. But actually, it was actually social violence, because most enslaved Africans were obtained through warfare, through trickery, banditry, or kidnapping. So what they call trade between Africans and Europeans for the 4 centuries before colonial rule, was essentially slavery. Next one. So the means by which slaves were acquired was generally not due to trade. And I just talked about the trickery and stuff. The number of enslaved Africans who were victims of the transatlantic slave trade has been estimated to be about 10 million, but many people think this is an underestimation because people weren't keeping track of who they were stealing, and they were taking from so many different ports. There was no organization to that. But it's also estimated that 15 to 20% of the enslaved Africans did in fact die. Not just during the transatlantic passage, that middle passage, but just from being brought from the interior of the continent to the coast. About 15 to 20% were lost. The violence that took place to militarily capture Africans also added, of course, to the numbers of the casualties. And the loss of this human capital caused a massive loss of human resources in the countries that were most impacted by the slave trade. I was very struck when I went to Sierra Leone in 2018. Just being there as someone who is returning to the home I never knew, but what was in fact my home. This is where my maternal ancestry was from. It just struck me that the biggest loss to the country was the loss of human resources, the people that were captured and taken away. And during that time, women were supposed to be between the ages of 15 and 30. Those are the ages they wanted them because of their ability to work, their youth, and their ability to produce children, so you can produce more commodities, if you will. But it just kind of struck me how many doctors, people that might have been doctors or lawyers or farmers or whatever, were lost to the country because of this. And he talks about this. And from the African viewpoint, the loss of people was the worst loss of all. The Shambhala of Tanzania say a king is people. And the Balanti of Guinea-Bissau felt that their family strength is represented by the number of hands available to cultivate the land. So when there's a population loss, there's a huge toll on Africa. It took a huge toll. So one of the things that did was stop advancement and instead cause stagnation on the continent. The extraction of human capital from Africa is only one side of the story, though. So you were taking away all these people from the continent, and yet there's a population growth in Europe. So you see some unevenness in terms of human development comes in. So the impact on the African economy was both directly and indirectly affected by the loss. So when you've removed all these people, you have questions of who's left to care for the land, who's there to fetch the water, who's there to care for the children. So people have to reorganize their society in order to deal with that. Who's there to battle nature? Because you didn't have people there to help battle and tame nature, when you had such things as a tsetse fly infection, or if there are a lot of them around, rather than battle them, you just had to leave the land, you just had to abandon the land. So those were some of the things that happened. And battling and taming nature is the basis of development. And so you see how that was impacted in Africa. There's also the psychological impact on the people who were left behind, because there's a lot of fear and uncertainty. When am I going to get attacked? When are our people going to get attacked again? And so that's going to, of course, impact your ability to feel comfortable and confident about continuing on with caring for the land. Okay. If you have that kind of uncertainty, it's going to impact your ability to think about things, to dream, to plan. So all of this impacted the development on Africa. Now there was some equivocation on the part of the Portuguese during the time of the slave trade, and even the Dutch tried to discourage it in the 17th century on the Gold Coast. But because African slaves were so important, in fact, they were more important than gold, by the end of the 17th century, it just kept going. During the colonial epoch, this is something that kind of added insult to injury, so that's why I put it in. The slaves that were under the control of the British were forced to sing this: "Rule Britannia, Britannia rule the waves. Britons never, never, never shall be slaves." So you're singing this to slaves. Kind of let them know, where they are. This was in the early 18th century. So let's look at some of the arguments for slavery. Because after all, it was good for Africa, right? Because those African leaders received commodities in exchange for these people. Well, the commodities that they got were the cheapest stuff these folks had, okay? These were not goods suitable for production or use in manufacturing. These were things that were designed to be used up quickly or stowed away. So things like cheap gin, cheap gunpowder, pots and kettles full of holes, beads, and other rubbish. Those were the commodities that the African kings had. But there were some African kingdoms that did grow, and I've listed them here. I'm not going to go into why. He talks about why, but we're not going to talk about that. But the Oyo, Benin, Dahomey, and Asante kingdoms did grow. Now the Asante, we've talked about them um, during our previous sessions, and they were some very, very smart people. And it was not without challenge, because the British did come to get the golden chair that symbolized the rule, and they had to hide that chair uh, and give them a fake one. I think they gave them a fake one to maintain their cultural and historical tradition. So what slavery did do was to, oh, they said it saved millions from starvation. That was another argument. Actually, it created the circumstances of starvation. And again, as we said earlier, it removed the able-bodied workers from the land. The impact of slavery did not occur just in Africa or in Europe. Because during this time, Asia and India became leaders in the cloth industry. And, you know, they had a great reputation. But then you find the British, I think it was the British, yes. The British worked very hard to destroy those industries because they wanted British cloth to be considered the best cloth in the world. Now, a country like Japan, which was highly feudal, highly developed feudal society, and if you think about that, Marx's progression, economic progression, feudal society precedes capitalism. But they decided that they were going to borrow from Europe and develop their society, and they were in a place developmentally to do it. They were also never enslaved or colonized, and information, technological information, was shared with them, unlike with Africa, which they wouldn't share. We were talking about the clothing industry earlier. Now, Ghanaians had already created kente cloth, which is very intricately made. So, seems to me like if they had gotten some of that European technology, they should have been able to use it, right? Because they had already come up with making this beautiful cloth on their own, but never got. They never got any technological assistance. In addition to failing to give technological assistance to Africa, Europe also put up some roadblocks. I guess they were asked for help in Egypt to help with the Aswan Dam. They refused, so the Soviet Union wound up helping them. And the same thing with the Tanzanian-Zambian railroad. They were asked to help, they refused, so China helped build that. So that made me think about like today's Western aid that we give. And what people complain about now is that strings are always attached. Okay? It's never just we're going to give this to you because you need it and you've asked for it. And I question whether aid is necessarily or really designed to solve problems. I believe, and many others believe, that aid is designed to maintain control, to maintain social control, not really to solve problems. So let's look a little bit about how economies normally grow. And normally what happens is that if you have neighboring economies that are growing, there's a tendency for them to merge so that the two parts can become a greater whole. But in Africa, because of the disruption, local economies were not allowed to grow or, of course, merge or achieve their economic goals. And the economic effect was that Africa was designed to serve external needs, not its internal needs. So one question is, can Africa be industrialized? And the thinking is that the markets for manufactured goods tend to be quite small. So there's not a big demand for, like, a clothes dryer. So let's talk a little history of Rwanda. The Mwami was the head of the kingdom. And I'm going to say his because I don't know of any female Mwami, although I have been told that the Mwami consulted with his wife and his mother. So there was a female role in leadership on some level. But the Mwami was the head of the kingdom, and his powers were sanctioned by both religious beliefs and religious rites. And we're going to talk about three Mwami, the last three. Let's talk about Rujigera. He's a famous Mwami from the 18th century. And you notice how when you're here in Kigali, you see a lot of police and military? Okay. This is why. This guy placed permanent military camps at strategic places throughout the country. And I thought this was very smart. At those frontier areas, you know, before people can come into your, you know, the more heavily populated areas, he put military outposts there, which, again, I kind of liked it. Gahindiro did more of the civil stuff. He overhauled the civil administration of the different provinces, villages, townships, I'm not sure what they were called. And he created a land chief and a cattle chief in each province. And I don't know if it, they said Rodney says he doesn't know if it was by design or just happened, but because the land chief and the cattle chief would sometimes argue with each other, the Mwami was safe. So they never got together to try to overthrow the Mwami. Rabugiri, or Kijeri IV, was known as the warrior king, and his claim to fame is that he kept most foreigners out of the kingdom. He was the first Rwandese king, though, to come in contact with Europeans, and many people consider him to be the last king, although he did die, and I think a son took over, but I don't think that he ruled very long or was very well respected. But Rabugiri is considered like the last king. So one of the things that Rodney says is that the social relations in Rwanda were more hierarchical, and that the structure of the society was more feudal than in other parts of Africa. And remember, again, if you talk about that economic progression, that seeing this made me wonder what would have happened had the Germans and the Belgians not come and interfered in the society. It might have been much different, the evolution or the development of the society. But there was a hierarchy, and there's an interdependence between the army, civil administration, and the very social fabric. So the hierarchical stuff was very important. Okay? Back to the Europeans. So not only were the Europeans grabbing and getting whatever they could from Africa's resources, they were also fighting each other. Of course, right? Why wouldn't they? And some countries in Africa were targeted for their immediate needs, and others they thought about for their anticipated future needs, which I thought was kind of interesting. Now, during colonialism, your education grew immensely in Europe and other countries, and they shared information with each other. But there was no intention, desire, or thought of helping black people become educated, because they had a certain role to play, right? So by the middle of the 19th century, slavery had served its purpose. It had made people millions and millions and millions of dollars. And you began to see a rise of domestic slavery. And this is kind of interesting because we had a discussion about this last week and then online about domestic slavery. We haven't posted that video yet, but we had an interesting discussion about that. And you did see an increased African response to the demand for European goods. So there were Africans who wanted more goods from Europe, and there were Europeans who wanted more things, and so there's more of a pressure on Africans to produce. And what we see is that Africans are now agents of European imperialism. Thank you for your attention to Chapter 4 in the series, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. We hope that you are enjoying it and learning some things you may not have known. Next week, we're going to move on to chapter 5. And I must tell you that this chapter gets more into the nitty gritty of exactly how Europeans exploited Africans on their own soil. So stay tuned for chapter 5 coming up soon. Thank you again.